Yeah, I would say the Mothership core is it's actually personally one of my least favorite units. We want units to be less air units to be less powerful, and we want ground units to be able to have higher power against air units overall, more Goliath type units.
I usually do
This
it so
feels
well.
like you're gonna spend a lot of time on editing tonight.
All right, it's time, Kevin. We're gonna talk about 1v1 multiplayer. Before I say anything else, talk about 1v1 multiplayer.
So a lot of our design, it's a
Just
very
tell me.
open-ended question, Winter.
Go, go, go! My life for Iron.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of our designs and philosophies around 1v1 player also apply to our competitive 3v3 mode. We think like designing an RTS is has a lot of fundamental that shares a lot of fundamental similarities between the various game modes. For our 1v1 multiplayer, we're taking a lot of inspiration from places like WarCraft 3, like StarCraft 1, Brood War, like StarCraft 2, and we're also taking a lot of inspiration from other RTSs. I know you've played Age of Empires recently. One of our favorites on the development team is the Company of Heroes franchise. But just overall, even outside the Blizzard universe, there's been so many innovations and so many interesting mechanics that you don't get to explore if you're just within a Blizzard RTS. There's also a lot of new ideas just in general gaming that we kind of take inspiration from. But of course, we're a Blizzard style RTS first and foremost, so we're going to start from there, and we're going to take a lot of lessons learned from years and years of esports and years of competition with StarCraft 1, with WarCraft 3, and with StarCraft 2. We have a lot of knowledge about what worked and what didn't there, and we're going to take a lot of those lessons and kind of try to bring them into the design of Stormgate.
I'm gonna continually narrow down the questions until we get to the details. But the next thing, my next question is game length. Like, a lot of games try to target a certain range
Mhm.
where like the game's gonna be between 20 and 35 minutes. That's a pretty common one, especially with MOBA style games. Or like Counter Strike, a round is 2 minutes, and then there are this many rounds. But the thing about StarCraft, for better or worse, the game could be 2 minutes or 2 hours, and you don't necessarily know. And nothing about the last game you played has anything to do with it. For Stormgate, are you looking at any sort of more artificial restrictions? Are you looking to maintain that literally anything could happen at almost any time feel of Blizzard RTS?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say this is a great example of something that we have different philosophies about with regards to 1v1 and 3v3. In 3v3, currently we're aiming for something around a time box of 20 minutes, which is to say like maybe the average game takes 20 minutes, and there's like some slight variance right there. Um, and with the 1v1, I would say I'm going to phrase this in two parts. Number one, we feel like overall we like the variability of how much the game lengths vary by, because it allows for players to kind of express themselves. You could be a turtle load player, you could be a mass expansion player, you could be a rushy player, you can do anything in between. And one of the beauties of 1v1 RTS, traditional 1v1 RTS, is that like the world is an open sandbox. With that in mind, part two is that um, we we do want to design the game in a way that games don't necessarily end super early and they don't necessarily end super late. And that I can divide that into two parts as well. I think one of the weaknesses in StarCraft 2 and StarCraft 1 even is that games are able to end so early. And I think that's down to a couple of things. Number one, there's a lot of knowledge in the early game that you need to know as a new player. For example, you really need to know how to wall off as like a Terran or a Protoss player. And even at the highest level, Protoss players lose all the time because their zealot was placed like half a pixel too far to the right. Right. So there's a lot of end game, like game ending moments early on, and we want to try to diminish those. And number two, just StarCraft overall does not have a very significant defender's advantage besides the high ramp advantage. So if we take a look at other RTSs such as Age of Empires, Company of Heroes, and Warcraft 3 especially, actually, those are games where there is more of an innate defender's advantage, and especially with Warcraft 3, it can be very asymmetrical. For instance, you have the orc base has these burrows, and they're like they don't shoot very fast, they're not very powerful, but they allow you to create. They have like some attacking power, and they allow you to defend from like a very early on rush. The peasants in Warcraft 3 can militia up, and they're able to fight alongside your army and fight off early game rushes. So those are kind of things that we feel like. Yes, you're still able to do harassment in early game as an opponent, but it means that you're not able to do completely game-ending damage at the early stages of the game. That can be very frustrating, especially for newer players. Imagine if you're a newer Zerg player, for instance, and you get like 2 racks every game, proxy 2 racks, right, or proxy 3 racks. And then on the other side of things, we're really trying to try to design the game in a way that it doesn't like just end up in these like turtle fests of I don't know, sky toss, for instance, right? Where 2 players are kind of just like standing still, like positioning and like not really doing anything. So maybe not so much like sky toss design, hopefully. And maybe not like a swarm host unit, for instance.
So you've mentioned Warcraft 3 as a lot of design inspiration, and then of course StarCraft and StarCraft 2. Warcraft 3 known for hero units, whereas StarCraft 2, you could argue there are hero units, but definitely in a less strict sense of having levels and items and stuff like that. So can you talk to us more about heroes and your plans for them in Stormgate?
Yeah, I'm going to preface this with a few things. The first preface is even though we are experimenting with heroes in all our game modes, we're still in the early phases of the game, and it's not a guarantee that heroes will be present in each of the game modes. Second preface, I think that when a lot of Blizzard RTS players hear the word heroes, they immediately think Warcraft 3 heroes because that's what they're familiar with. In reality, I think it's more like a spectrum where StarCraft 2 features no heroes, whereas Warcraft 3 features like heroes with the whole shebang, with leveling and with items, for instance. And when we got feedback, when we thought about what makes heroes great and what are some of the negatives about heroes, the 2 primary negatives that we hear of is the threat of over centralization. Units tend to group up around the hero, and the threat of snowballing. And that happens a lot with the EXP system. In Warcraft 3, for instance, every unit that you kill of your opponents is kind of tracked, and so it's very permanent. Your like how winning you are within a given game. So with that in mind, starting from Warcraft 3, we're going to remove the idea of items. We're going to remove the idea of leveling. And what heroes, the current iteration of what heroes are in our current game is it's kind of going to just be kind of a slightly stronger unit, that a slightly stronger, unique unit that maybe you can revive throughout the game. That this is a lot of things for us. For example, this does provide us with a unit that you can kind of use in the early game in order to scout your opponents, in order to kind of see what they're doing out on the map.
Would a good comparison kind of be the Phoenix Commander in StarCraft 2, where he has options for what he wants to do, but in and of himself isn't that strong of a unit on the field?
Yeah, I would say that is a pretty good comparison. A lot of our inspiration does come from the idea of general co-op commanders, where they are unique units on the battlefield, but they are not necessarily. They don't, with very few exceptions, they don't level up throughout the course of a game. However, I will say co-op commanders. Their heroes are extremely powerful, and we probably would not aim for that power level in a competitive mindset.
The baseline of every RTS is resource gathering.
Yeah.
Can you give us any, at least the broad strokes on what resource gathering will look like? Are we looking at 2 resources gathered by 1 worker? Is there some sort of automated system like some games have? Anything you can share with us on that?
Yeah, so there's just RTS economy design is one of my favorite topics in RTS design overall. So definitely have a lot of thoughts there. So I guess I'll start off with currently in our game right now, we have the idea of 2 resource types, and they're going to be very similar to what StarCraft 2 has, in that there is a primary resource, and then there is more of a rate limited tech resource. We really like the idea that with Vespian gas, you can kind of count the amount of gas that your opponent has spent and then deduce what other things he could be doing. So for example, if you see at X timing, your opponent has 1 Colossi, you know for a fact that there's no way he can have a Void Ray as well because of the extra gas you would need to spend in the Stargate and the Void Ray, right? In terms of the primary resource, in terms of the primary resource, we're taking a lot of inspiration from primarily 2 places. The first is StarCraft 1, where every worker has diminishing returns. Every subsequent worker has diminishing returns. And what that means is that the first worker that I make has like mines at 100% efficiency. The second worker might mine at 98% efficiency, and so on and so on. And this accomplishes 2 things, we believe. The first is that it really encourages players to expand, and not only does it do that, it encourages players to expand by encouraging them to expand rather than punishing them for not expanding. So just as an example, if you have 10 workers across 2 bases, you're going to have a stronger economy than having 10 workers on 1 base. So again, going back to the idea of territory control is like, I would say, almost the core primary game pillar that we have to encourage that. And we feel like encouraging players to expand with our economy design is going to help to accomplish that goal. The second benefit of diminishing returns, which is similar to what we had in Brood War, is the idea that harassment is going to be less impactful. If each subsequent worker matters less, then basically, if I kill half of your workers, your economy is only going to be impacted by 33%. Whereas in StarCraft 2, for instance, if you kill half the workers, you're literally exactly half your economy is going to be destroyed. So another aspect that we're taking inspiration from is worker gathering asymmetry. And both from the WarCraft 3 standpoint and the Age of Empires standpoint, we think those games do a lot of great things in that workers have very different strengths and weaknesses, right? Some factions or some races mine more efficiently in one way or another, and some factions gather resources in either a more or less vulnerable way than other factions. So if we take the Night Elf race, for instance, right, their wisps are completely protected in the gold mines. However, they are very vulnerable on trees, and they can put their workers on any part of the map onto these trees. Which makes them very unique. Often the focus of harassment for a human or a night elf player is on these workers, whereas the focus of harassment on an orc player is often the squishy burrows rather than the workers, because the workers can get into the burrows and protect themselves. So those workers are not as vulnerable. We think there's a lot of opportunities for asymmetry there, and a lot of opportunities for factions to harass each other in different ways. In StarCraft 2, I would say like almost like 95% of harassment is focused on the workers. And in our game, we want to try to make it so that harassment is more varied and focus on a lot of different attributes.
That I'm very excited to see what that looks like. And I think kind of related, but moving a little further into the game, scouting. RTS is essentially a poker game where based on what's on the field so far and how much you've scouted, like what your opponent could have in their hand or what they likely have, what's on the field. What kind of importance are you placing on active scouting and just general thoughts around keeping track and tabs on your opponent?
Yeah, we definitely want to create more opportunities for players to scout. And we take a lot of inspiration from example Age of Empires, where you kind of get like a horse in the beginning of the game, and you're able to kind of run around the map and just use that horse to scout around. So we want to essentially give players units that are very naturally inclined to scout, and give players more tools to scout. Such that it's both more obvious for a new player that they have to scout, or that it's easy to scout, and also even for a more experienced player, such that like they're not using this resource or this like unit. There's no other better way to use this unit.
I
For
believe
example,
the Age of Empires unit is literally called Scout, so that
yeah.
one So, what sort of variety of strategies in Stormgate are you looking for? For example, in StarCraft 2, you have anywhere from, let's take Protoss, which many people know, the being on the receiving end of not scouting. Protoss has a lot of things like, oh, you didn't see the Dark Shrine, and then one DT gets in, and you've kind of lost the game.
Mhm.
Are you looking at a lot of these pain points from StarCraft 2, and is it still going to rely on scouting, or are you looking for other ways of going about that?
Yeah, so you brought up, I kind of want to touch on two things that you just brought up there. Number one is the idea that you didn't scout something and you immediately lost the game. And we're going to try to remove as many of those moments as possible. So for example, with your example of Dark Templar, the idea that you didn't scout this cloaked unit and therefore you die, we want to take that away. So our current iteration of how cloaking works in our game is that it more works closely to WarCraft 3, in which when you are cloaked, yes, you do need enemy detection for them to see you, but if every time you attack, you break that cloaking. So maybe yes, you kill one worker because you have this like cloaked unit, but you're not able to essentially eliminate the enemy worker line. The other thing we're looking into regarding scouting is, I think with your examples from StarCraft 2 in particular, I think one thing that StarCraft 2 suffers from is basically it was a box product with 2 expansions, and every subsequent expansion, um, we felt forced to add like 2 more units, for instance, right? And you often come up with these situations where you do scout something, but you're not sure like what the information you're getting is. And I think the primary example is as a Terran player, let's say I scout a robotics support bay. And I know exactly what unit my opponent's making now. It's going to be the Colossi, right? But wait a minute, it could also be the Disruptor. And both these units kind of accomplish very similar things, but they generally require different responses. They require either maybe a Liberator or a Viking, for instance, right? Um, and we want to try to remove too many of those moments as well. So we want to make it sure that anytime you scout something, it's very clear of what the enemy is making. We don't want to make it so like you scouted this tech building and oh, there's like 5 different units you can make from this tech building.
From what I'm hearing so far, it's reminding me of a bit of a Brood War situation where you're focused less on a wide variety of different units. Like StarCraft 2 has a lot of ability focused units, like
Mhm.
especially Protoss, but just in general. There's a lot of ghosts and liberators and tanks or queens and infestors and vipers, etc., etc. But Brood War is more about maybe 2 or 3 core units on the outside, and then maybe one powerful spellcaster. Is that more the style you're looking for with Stormgate, with these core unit compositions?
Yeah, I would say how I would describe that overall is we take a lot of inspiration from Brood War and how it handles the skill floor versus the skill ceiling. One of the cool things about Brood War is that players often differentiate themselves with how they move their units rather than how they point and click their abilities. Um, just the idea that like units move differently with the patrol button and the move button, and most players will just right click in order to move. But if you're like a pro player, you can use the patrol button to kind of move around, and you can use different angles to control like exactly what your unit is doing. And we think this is a great example of something that like um, it's a very low barrier to entry, but pro players can kind of take that extra step with things such as with Reaver drops, for instance. And the best example from StarCraft 2, I would say, is Warp Prism drops with Immortals. There's a lot of skill that can be expressed there, and it allows a lot of Protoss players to differentiate themselves.
So you mentioned a focus on skill floor versus skill ceiling, like in Brood War. And technologically, Brood War less advanced. You can only select 12 units at a time, and those 12 units didn't always listen exactly to where you wanted them to go. StarCraft 2, obviously much more advanced. Our units very efficient at running directly into their death at half a dozen different forms of splash damage. So how do you kind of reconcile this overall with Stormgate? I guess I'm asking, like, is there less of a focus on splash damage, slower units in general, more HP? What are you looking at right now with Stormgate?
Yeah, so I guess One of the things that we want to move away from in terms of StarCraft is the really high lethality of StarCraft 2, especially. You're not looking for 1 second and your entire army can potentially die. We feel like that's really, it's not so approachable for a lot of new players, especially to be that punishing, because you are really forced to keep track of everything all at once. Right. So we're going to try to initially we're going to try to move somewhere between where StarCraft 1 was and where WarCraft 3 is in terms of lethality, and that it gives you more of a chance to micro around and to kind of even if you don't notice a fight initially, the fight is not over by the time that you pan your camera to the actual fight itself. Um, in terms of in terms of like units going to their deaths, another thing that we're looking into is you kind of brought this up basically the idea of like we want to be able to prevent death balls, and we want to make sure that it's not super efficient to kind of a move your entire army towards one distinct sector. A lot of that I think is because of StarCraft 2's really powerful pathfinding, which we do hope to replicate in Stormgate. But we have a lot of strategies to mitigate death balling. One aspect of it is just thinking about the each unit individually. For example, the Sentry, though it might not be obvious at the time it was being made, is kind of like it promotes the death balls with its force field abilities. And similarly, the Colossi kind of does the same thing. So paying attention to unit designs is one of the key components. The other ideas are kind of the density of units. One of the reasons that StarCraft 2 can create these death ball scenarios is that units can really bunch up very heavily, especially the very small units. So we're going to be looking a lot at unit radii, um, especially for the smaller units, so that they are not able to completely like you can't fit like 20 Marines kind of firing from a single point, or 20 Void Rays or firing from a single point to impact to basically like instantly delete that point. And then finally, we're looking things such as unit ranges. One of the most powerful aspects of StarCraft is that like because you pack up so tightly and unit ranges tend to be very high in StarCraft 2, therefore like you're able to fit more units on the screen to hit that single point. So managing unit power density is something that we're really concerned about.
I'm glad to hear it. One of the main things I say with StarCraft 2 is the original designers didn't realize how powerful the engine was. So they were kind of designing with a Brood War mindset, but with StarCraft 2, just those units are so efficient at dealing with each other. And you did touch, I just want to reiterate again, because it's still to this day, a major point of StarCraft 2 is things like force multipliers, specifically air units and spellcasters. You're saying a much more limited focus on them. Does that mean you're limited specifically in the number you're looking at, or they're just almost so cost inefficient or costly that it's prohibitive?
I would say, speaking of air units in particular, we're going to try to do two things. Number one, we're going to assign a higher power budget or we're going to assign a higher power budget to the idea that units can fly. For example, the fact that a carrier can fly just in itself without the stats involved means that it's a very powerful unit. And we would not necessarily make it as powerful in Stormgate. Two other aspects of it is like it's not just the ground units themselves. Or not the air units themselves, but I feel like the relative lack of ground to air counters in StarCraft 2. There's not as many Goliath type units, for instance. I think just in general RTS, ground versus ground fights are really interesting because they are able to kind of traverse the terrain in interesting ways. They interact with the terrain, and also ground versus air fights are interesting because one type of what the air units don't care about the terrain, but the ground units do. So you can have a battle of power versus mobility, but the air versus air fights are kind of the least interesting because neither side cares about that terrain, and they just kind of run into each other. And unfortunately, StarCraft 2 features a lot of air versus air battles that don't really care about terrain as much. And at Stormgate, again, one of our core design philosophies is territory control, and another is the importance of terrain. And I would say a third big one is defender's advantage. So all of these lead to the ideas of we want units to be less air units to be less powerful, and we want ground units to be able to have higher power against air units overall, more Goliath type units. And then finally, we want to make sure with the carrier and specifically that the air units are way more specialized. We don't want kind of like a more of a catch-all air unit. So for instance, the carrier, yes, it technically does get countered by corruptors, for instance, but you're still able to kind of form this Protoss Deathball with Templar, with some Void Rays, with carriers, such that it's almost an unbeatable army. And we're going to do our best to make units more specialized in such a way that there is always a way for your opponent to twist their army in order to more counter the death ball that you have, or like the super powerful army that you have. We want, so for instance there, if you're amassing like a carrier army with Templar, we want to give you stronger anti-carrier counters, and we don't want carriers to be generally very efficient at killing almost everything.
So you mentioned counters in general. I would say there's a wide variety. There's StarCraft 2, which is technically a Marine can counter everything. Like, there are units that do damage against light, armored, but generally there are not too many hard counters outside of, like, some units can't hit air, kind of stuff like that. And then there's the Age of Empires side of it, where, for example, a skirmisher gets a ridiculous amount of bonus damage against archers and spearmen, but they do almost no damage to other units like swordsmen, and they even have like a minimum range, so they're very hard countered by other units. So I'd say those are the two different ends of the spectrum, just in your basic unit counters. For Stormgate, what level of unit counters, like built into units, are you looking at?
Yeah, I would say it really depends, honestly. Like, I feel like the fact that a Marine can kind of counter everything is kind of interesting, because the Marine is a very high skill cap unit, and I think it's really interesting that players can kind of manage this very high skill cap unit such that like they're put in unfavorable positions and are able to come out from that. However, for units that maybe, for example, are later in the tech tree and later in the and more powerful units overall, I think it might be more healthy, especially for late game units, such that you have this idea of like these overlapping system of counters, such that late game you are able to twist your army to counter those late game units.
We talked about unit counters and not looking away for 1 second and losing your entire army. But a lot of StarCraft 1 and 2 is economy management, or less generously phrased, busy work management.
Mhm.
How much is Stormgate going to be focusing on things like creep spread, inject, building workers, and how much is focus on army and composition and tactics?
Yeah, so in terms of busy work and resource and just macro mechanics overall, I would say we're trying to eliminate busy work, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to try to eliminate macro mechanics. I think if we were to kind of look back at 12 years of StarCraft 2 and really analyze all the different macro mechanics in the game, we can kind of take a look at what worked and what didn't. I think so. I think the most successful mechanic in terms of macro mechanics in StarCraft 2 probably is creep spread, in that it's interesting. At least in the beginning of StarCraft 2, it was very interesting in that you had to make a decision as to the direction that you spread your creep, and like because people generally made fewer queens back then, it was there was higher opportunity cost for spreading that creep. However, I feel like that decision making is less important these days, because number one, you get so many creeps. Number two, players have gotten so much better at creep spreading, and number three, players have discovered certain hotkey tricks that allow you to spread creep very easily. So I feel like that decision making has become very trivial. Next, inject. I think inject initially. I think if you told me about the injectability and you framed it as like, oh, maybe you have like 2 or 3 queens at a given time in any given game, I would think that injectability is actually pretty interesting, in that you have to make a decision. There's energy tension on the queen. Do I transfuse? Do I inject? Or do I creep spread? However, because right now the meta is, or kind of like always the meta has been, you have a queen at each hatchery, and you're always injecting all the time, it has been like kind of delegated to busy work, and it has been delegated to, it's kind of like a skill check basically for newer players. We want to try to eliminate that, and we want to try to make macro mechanics that create interesting decisions for skill. Taking a look at the other mechanics, another one I want to talk about is the mule mechanic. I think this one is a bit more interesting um, in that yes, you do have to balance how many mules you put down, or versus how many scans you use, right? But oftentimes, or almost all the time, um, it feels like an inconsequential choice, honestly. Like it's generally, unless like you suspect your opponent is going cloaked units, you generally want to like kind of spam your mules on cooldown, and that's the kind of busy work we want to avoid. A thought experiment I had is like, I think it'd be really interesting if the command center or the orbital command had a third ability, like the supply drop ability, that was more competitive. I think when the supply drop ability was initially conceived, it was more of like, oh, we don't want supply depots, we don't want Terran players to be supply blocked with supply depots, and this is kind of like a get out of jail card, free card. But I think if orbital commands had that third ability, if we somehow made that supply drop ability more competitive and more interesting, like let's say like supply drop doubled the HP of supply depots, for instance, and then you could use it to make walls. Just that simple modification might make it more interesting and might make it more of a choice of whether you mule or you drop that supply. So basically, in terms of macro mechanics, we want to focus on choices that feel interesting, and we never want to add a macro mechanic that just is busy work for the player.
So you're actually looking more at something like the Nexus with Chrono Boost, where it
Yeah.
is an active decision of, do I Chrono Boost probes? Do I Chrono Boost my forge? That does feel like the largest macro decision, even if it's the most overall simplistic. So that is the direction for Stormgate.
Yeah,
Alright.
the Chrono Boost is really interesting as well. I'm glad you brought that up, but I would agree overall with your analysis of Chrono Boost. But we've gone back and forth over the years in the development of StarCraft of between whether Chrono Boost is just an ability that you put on a building and it remains there, or if it's energy based and you have to spend those charges. Um, I would say there's definitely advantages and disadvantages of both, and there's not like a strong winner of which is better over the other. But I would say in the context of busy work, I feel like the ability to just put a chrono boost on a building and have it like be maintained on the building would fall into the more of the philosophy of where we are right now with Stormgate, and that we want it to be an interesting decision, and we don't want it necessarily to be busy work that players have to pay attention to at all times. Now, I could play devil's advocate and argue completely in the opposite direction, however, but I'm going to stick with what I have right now.
I like it. All right. So I want to kind of rehash one point, but bring in an entirely new one. Map design, unit design, and defender's advantage. And
Mhm.
I don't think I need to expand more on that. I think you understand where I'm going with it. But I will anyways. Map design in StarCraft 2, we essentially have arguably 3 different types of maps, but it's more like 1.5 different types, and then the maps everyone vetoes. So how are you going to go about a wider variety of map design in Stormgate? And how does do things like unit design and defender's advantage factor in?
Right. I think just having looked at the history of StarCraft 2, I think one issue with StarCraft 2 is that it has number one, we talked about this before, but the idea that you have to know how to wall off on on pretty much every map, in as the Terran and Protoss player, and that's a lot of knowledge that I don't think we can expect a lot of newer players to come in with. And it's honestly, I feel a little tedious with every map rotation. You have to learn exactly how you have to wall off. There's Gemini, for example, puts out guides every season for new maps of like, how do you wall off this base as Protoss? How do you wall off that natural? So those are the kind of things we want to avoid. Number one. Number two, I feel like there's a lot of individual unit designs in StarCraft 2 that really force map makers to go in very specific directions. The best examples off the top of my head, Reapers. Because you have Reapers, and the game has kind of balanced the idea that like Reapers can scout the main of other players, you necessarily have these Reaper cliffs on built into every map. And in the past, things like Liberators, for example, Liberators forced it so that 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 you had to have like this X amount of airspace or limit the amount of airspace behind enemy bases. And one of my favorite ones, if you think back in the Wings of Liberty days, back when like Stefano Roachmax was a thing, maps had to be designed with the thought in mind that like players had to be able to defend the Stefano Roach style. With X number of force fields at their third. So I think for a lot of these reasons, map design has been very limited. And one thing we can do there is reinforce the idea of defender's advantage, like you mentioned and you kind of alluded to. The idea that, like I mentioned earlier on, in Warcraft 3, you have like kind of this innate defender's advantage built into your base. The burrow, as an example, is the orc's defender's advantage. The Moonwell is something that players just built, like it's part of the build order, but it also provides some sort of defender's advantage. And Militia is another one, Blight is another one. But to tie it all together, higher defender's advantage, and the idea that individual units are designed with the mindset of how are these going to affect? How is this going to affect terrain? How will this impact map design? We eventually wanted to get it into a space where map design is very unlimited. We are able to have really cool StarCraft 1 style maps, such as my favorite map in StarCraft 1 ever, Outsider.
The map editor should be available early on in public development after the game is in beta or at the very least at release. And the focus will be on community map creation and promoting interesting design maps. Is that true?
Yeah, so I feel like where we're heading to, or the ideal for us right now, is to kind of follow a trajectory very similar to that of StarCraft 2, where initially Frost Giant creates all the multiplayer maps, but eventually, as the community is more familiar with the game and more familiar with like what breaks things, what makes a map feel good, we do want to give the community opportunities to kind of come into to kind of come in and make their own maps. And we do want to have a system such similar to the TLMC, for instance, the Team Liquid Map Contest, where these maps have a path to go from just a fan-made map into the actual ladder.
So StarCraft 2 has a lot of situations where you just look back and you've lost half your mineral line to a Widow Mine, to Zerglings, to whatever comes in. And there aren't a lot of easy ways to recover. You've talked about how with diminishing returns, it's a little easier to get back to a stable level of income. But generally, what are you looking at to help players recover if they've taken damage in the game? What kind of comeback mechanics are you designing right now?
Yeah, so specifically with harassment in mind, we want to make it so that the harassment is not necessarily designed with workers in mind. We want to make it so like specific buildings are more vulnerable so that there can be more nuance in harassment. Just for example, if we take a look at Warcraft 3, a lot of the harassment that you do is not necessarily due to worker losses, but due to for example, you're harassing a building and the workers are forced to be pulled in order to repair the building. So you lose a lot of resources, not only from pulling the workers so that they're not mining, but you're also losing resources from the cost to repair the building itself. So designing more ways for nuanced harassment is a goal that we're striving towards. In terms of comeback mechanics, I would say that we're trying to make it so that comeback mechanics are more on a faction by faction basis. So for example, if one faction loses a unit, maybe their next unit becomes cheaper, or they're able to like summon a skeleton from the ground, for instance. So those are kind of some of the examples that we're looking at right now.
Win conditions. Is the plan for 1v1 the same as pretty much all Blizzard RTS? Destroy your opponent's buildings. That is essentially what it boils down to. Is that going to stay consistent with Stormgate?
Yeah, so I think the traditional win condition of 1v1 RTS, I like to frame it as annihilation, destroy all your opponent's buildings. And if you still really like that, and we definitely want to keep at least a version of that, something very similar to that in Stormgate, where it is very open-ended. You're able to utilize a whole variety of strategies. You can turtle, you can rush, you can mass expand, you can play the econ game, and we feel like that is really the strength of Annihilation. That the world is an open canvas, and you can kind of play it however well you'd like. Um, um, However, in the 3v3 game mode, we're kind of trying to divorce ourselves from that, because Annihilation means that you are eliminating a player overall. And we never want it so that a player feels completely eliminated from the game. We want it to always feel like a 3v3, where players are always are always uh, uh, are always in the game. So we're taking a look at a lot of other alternate win conditions. Two of them being, let's say, assassination. Assassination is the idea that um, there's like a key unit or a key building that you have to destroy in order to win the game. For example, Supreme Commander has such a mode in which you have to kill a very specific enemy, and MOBAs have a thing where you have to kill an enemy nexus. We're also taking a lot of inspiration um, uh, from games such as Company of Heroes, the Company of Heroes and Dawn of War franchises with capture points. One of the interesting things about capture points is the idea that they are often in the middle of the map, and there's often fights surrounding those capture points. And what's really cool about that, especially in a 3v3 mode, is that players are encouraged to go into the middle of the map and therefore show their hand, show what their army is. We kind of talked about scouting early on in this talk, and I feel like this is a natural way to encourage players to kind of scout each other, because you're encouraged to show your hand. Let's say it's very much easier for your opponent to see what you're making. So there's a lot of natural scouting advantages that come up from this particular win condition. So we're not ready to announce exactly what the win condition for Stormgate 3v3 will look like, but these are just kind of some of the things that we're thinking about.
When it comes to watching the game, which is something most people do with StarCraft 2 nowadays, as opposed to playing themselves, especially on this channel, but when it comes to watching the game, how much does that factor into your design? Or what parts of StarCraft 2 do you think are the best to watch, and how can you translate that into Stormgate?
Yeah, so I think one of the coolest parts about StarCraft is relative to a lot of other spectator esports, it's relatively easy for a new player to come in and tell who's winning or what's going on. And there are things you can do, such as look at the mini map. Whose color is more predominant on the mini map? Or you can look at the supplies, right? You can kind of tell from there who is winning. So those are kind of the two things that we're looking into. Um, uh, that I think are going to help Stormgate become a great spectator esport. Because again, we are really focused on the idea of territory control. So we want players to be expanding all the time. We want players to be able to take that territory, and hopefully it can be like a back and forth where the battle lines are always being shifted, and you can tell who's controlling what territory and who's winning just based off of the mini map. That being said, I think I do think that overall the viewability of a game to be successful as an esport is relatively overrated. I think if you just take a look at the popular esports out there, like by far the biggest factor of how popular an esports is by its audience, especially the casual audience, right? And that directly scales. If you have more fans of the game, you have more viewers of your esport. And I think that's partly why we want to create a game that is not only appeals to core players, but also is able to gain a wider audience. If we gain a wider audience, we'll be able to attract more players in order to watch our esports. So in a way, recruiting casual players is going to help our most competitive players.
StarCraft 2 kind of suffered from almost a feeling of purgatory, especially at the end of each year before the ESL Pro Tour became a thing, where we didn't really know, is there going to be a balance patch? What does the pro scene look like? What kind of community feedback is actually getting through? I think this was a major pain point, speaking as a member of that community, and also just as a content creator and player. Those yearly patches were a big draw for me. And you've already talked about kind of having regular content, but when it comes specifically to balance patches and changing the game, are you looking at that seasonal basis as the focus?
Yeah, so I would say the philosophy behind the balancing of StarCraft 2 was largely determined by two things. Number one, I think StarCraft 2, number one, was the successor to StarCraft 1. And StarCraft 1 had this legacy of like it's a game that never changes. It's a game that players can really perfect. It's a game that like players get to a mastery level and you're proud of that mastery level. And the only thing that changes is the maps. And I think a lot of the philosophy around StarCraft 2 has been centered around we want to preserve that from StarCraft 1. We kind of want to try to mimic what StarCraft 1 is. Times are changing, so I don't know how much of that will be. It should be a factor going into future games. The second aspect of it is that while we were on the StarCraft 2 team, we were always somewhat unsure of like when is going to be our stopping point, right? When is this going to be our last patch? So oftentimes we had to think of with that in mind, what changes can we actually do with the mindset of, oh, like this might be the next last patch, or like 2 patches from now it might be the last patch. So we were relatively hampered from making 2 bold changes with that mindset. With Stormgate, we're going to have a completely different philosophy. We're going to have the philosophy that first of all, we're starting off not as a box product. We're going to be starting off as a free-to-play game, a game that really we want to develop content that supports players and supports the community, and therefore we're going to have regular content releases, and therefore regular points in time when we are able to release balance patches, where we are able to release big changes to the game on a regular basis. And I think this really appeals to kind of a more modern community that is always looking for new things, and appeals to especially guys like you, Winter, who are content creators or who always want to see play with the new cool shiny things, right? That being said, we're also open to having balance patches in between seasons as well as they are needed, depending on community sentiment. One other cool thing about Stormgate and one cool thing about Frost Giant is I think hopefully you've seen that Frost Giant is like a relatively open studio, and I feel like Frost Giant, in terms of communication, Frost Giant, I think as a smaller studio, we can be more open than like a larger company at Blizzard, where it's a larger company. You know, there's a lot of things going on, and we had to be careful not to impact other teams as well. So yeah, definitely a lot more communication at Stormgate, and that's something that I can kind of promise right now.
StarCraft 2 historically has balanced the game for the top, the Serals, the MVPs, the Marus, the Nestees of players historically. And that, I think, was necessary. The problem is the kind of trickle down effect was that uh, the balancing for those top single, maybe low double digit amount of players ended up skewing the experience of everyone else. Essentially, 99.9% of the player base. How do you handle this with Stormgate, and what are your ideas for that?
Yeah, I could talk about this topic for literally hours, but I'm gonna try to sum it up in a few minutes, I would say. So I would say like overall, like in terms of balancing philosophy, there's kind of like 2 schools of thought. And the first is like everything should be balanced 50-50-50, right? And the second school of thought is like it's the community perception that matters. If the community perception is that the game is balanced, then everything is great, right? Um, and I tend to fall into more of the second camp, where I think overall, as like if you're a balance designer, first and foremost, you're a game designer, and I feel like the purpose of a game designer is to ensure that everyone has fun, right? And I feel like community perception has a lot to do with how much fun you're having. If you're frustrated and you feel like you're losing because of balance, that can be a very, very terrible experience, right? And related to like the 1% thing, I think it really depends between game to game, but with StarCraft and like high level RTS in particular, I feel like player perception around balance is really balanced around the top 1 players. Players like look at those top 1 players and say, "Oh, this guy won a tournament, like therefore X race is the best," right? So I think that's one strong argument for balancing in favor of the very high level players, right? Um, However, like that's not to say we've like in StarCraft 2, there's never been balance changes made for lower level players in mind, right? So I think two prime examples I have is number one, the addition of like the F2 key, which I know top level players use, the addition of auto attacks to units such as the High Templar. And another very prominent one is the the removal of cloak initially on the Widow Mine, right? So the Widow Mine drop in Heart of the Swarm and even Legacy of the Void was a strategy that was much easier to execute than it was to defend. You had to have very crisp warp gate timings and very crisp like gateway timings. You had to have stalkers at exactly the right places to defend it. And I feel like at a certain level, it was the skill needed to defend it was just overwhelming. And even though you did see even top pros losing to it, like it generally wasn't like too much of issue at the top level play. So I think that is like one situation in the history of StarCraft that I can think of where like a balance change was arguably like needed to be made in order especially for the lower level players or like the mid level players, I would say. Another aspect that we learned is that if you balance just for stats, oftentimes a matchup can be completely balanced, but it's unfun, right? You can think about like the TVZ Broodlord Infestor days and Wings of Liberty, and we can even think about like Sky Toss more recently. Like maybe the matchup is completely balanced, but players are not having fun. So a lot of like quote unquote balancing is like more like game design. Like how do we like morph it so that players are working with more interesting interactions rather than just making sure everything is fair, everyone is winning at exactly the same rate. And with respect to that, again, I could go on for hours. With respect to that, I think one thing that we learned in throughout the 12 years of StarCraft 2 is the idea that I think the average player um, heavily like outweighs the importance of late game balance with regards to their perception of balance, right? So a matchup can be 50-50, right? But if one race feels that, oh, I never win in the late game, that feels really bad. And that can skew their perception from like in reality it's a 50-50 matchup, but it's in their heads it's like a 60-40 matchup not in favor of them. And if you feel that way, especially the problem, I think one problem that happens is like you always feel like you're on a clock to kill your opponent, and there's just always like this pressure in your mind that like I have to kill them, I have to kill them, I have to kill them, and that's like an example of something in RTS, an additional stress in RTS that we don't want for players.
You essentially expanded on the point, and the summary is, if I had to bring it down to a single sentence, you're balancing for fun, and fun is balance.
Mhm. Yeah.
So at the end of the day, there's no direct answer. Like whatever the fun unit composition is. Like personally in StarCraft 2, even though my Terran versus Zerg is kind of terrible, I have like a 30% win rate. I still like playing it because I play that like marine tank back and forth. It feels fun to play because you have all these units that you have agency over, and then the Zergs going back and forth as well. Whereas Zerg versus Protoss is a little more like, how do you counter carriers? And then when the answer comes back, as it has for 12 years of don't let them get them, that of course is something you're trying to avoid, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and like the idea of like don't let them get there, I think it's a cool ideal to have. But in reality, I think balancing around that is extremely difficult. And the two ways we hope to achieve this is I talked about this before, more specialized units in the late game, such that you are able to like shift your army towards an army that more better counters your opponent's army. And number two, we don't necessarily want to balance the game around totally army versus army late game battles. For example, one faction might have a better ability to harass the opponent, while the primary or do you have like this strong faction that's better at like army fighting? So those are just some of the tools in our toolbox that allow us to kind of create a more quote unquote balanced and fun late game.
With with regards to late game, I personally think that one of the games that handles it the best is Age of Empires 2, which does have the benefit of things like air units not existing for obvious reasons, but it has this situation where you have trash units, which is a little bit of a mean way of saying it, but units that are very cheap with plentiful resources that just constantly fight it out. And then, of course, the defender's advantage being very high with literal walls and things like castles and high ground. Uh, as opposed to StarCraft 2, where it does feel like you kind of have to retreat into your corner, and as soon as you reach out, you better kill them. So, is there anything you can take from Age of Empires 2 in that constantly battling in the late game? And how would you implement it in a modern RTS?
Yeah, I think your example of Age of Empires 2, like we can even like kind of transpose it onto StarCraft, right? Some of the coolest late game interactions in StarCraft are, let's say, between Terran versus Zerg, with Marine battles versus Zergling and Baneling battles, and that's a situation where you use these like very cheap, very low tier units, and you try to control territory, and you try to take over, you try to like, use your mobility to take over your opponent and gain economic advantages. Often Terran versus Zerg is, especially in the late game, is about outmaneuvering your opponent so that you snipe off like this one base here, this one base there, and you kind of keep up the tempo. And by the very end, you get that one extra base, and that's how you win. So both in Age of Empires 2 and StarCraft 2, we kind of want to take the lesson learned that not necessarily the late game units that you want are going to be like the super high tech units. You definitely still will want some kind of a mobility. So I think it's the idea of balancing mobility versus late game tech units that are just overall very powerful. That is integral for late game health in an RTS.
So in StarCraft 2, there's pretty much complete asymmetry between the factions. You do have units that fill every single role. Like you have air to ground, air to air, etc., but there's a big difference in how you accomplish that. Age of Empires, on the other hand, partially because of its historical nature, has a much closer spread of units. Do you on that spectrum, I guess, what kind of difference between the two factions you've announced do you foresee there being in terms of units in 1v1?
Yeah, I would say that as a Blizzard style RTS, we're definitely aiming for something closer to that in StarCraft 2. And even within Blizzard style RTSs, there's like a lot of differentiation in terms of unit design, asymmetry. Like, for example, WarCraft 3 is the units are fairly asymmetrical, but they're not as asymmetrical as they are in StarCraft 2. So, in terms of unit design, we're aiming for that of StarCraft 2. However, in terms of worker design, we think Warcraft 3 has a lot of good lessons there, and we want to take from there as well. Another lesson that we've learned fairly recently is that we feel like there's a potential to be overloaded on asymmetry. If every faction works completely differently on every single level, then oftentimes the either A, the game can break apart, or B, there's too much to learn about an enemy faction. So, for example, if I'm just starting in as the human race and my opponents, which are playing a different faction, are playing completely differently, it can get overwhelming very quickly. I think a great example here is the goo race in Grey Goo. Um, the goo race, I think, from a design perspective, was one of like the absolute coolest like RTS faction designs I've ever seen. But I think um, eventually one problem with that design is that it twisted the rules of the game so much that a topic that you discussed, like map design, had to be really shaped and balanced around the ability for the goo to essentially ignore terrain. So we got back to map design, we got back to terrain, the importance of terrain, all within this one question.
Yeah. So you mentioned hero units in general. And one sort of hero unit we've had in StarCraft 2, even though it didn't level up in a regular sense or anything like that, was the Mothership core. A bit of a divisive option throughout StarCraft 2 history. Can you tell us more about your thoughts on the Mothership core and maybe how it relates to RTS design?
Yeah, I would say the Mothership Core is, even though it is kind of like a hero unit, it's actually personally one of my least favorite units ever introduced in StarCraft 2. And I remember I was playing Terran back in Heart of the Swarm, and there was this very specific game of Innovation versus a Protoss on Frost. It was that four-player map, and basically what had happened is like around like the 10-minute mark, Innovation like tried to doom drop with 4 medevacs into the Protoss's base, and it was fended off by a single mothership core sitting on top of like 2 pylons. And I felt like that was the moment that actually made me quit the game at that point. That like this one unit could like just do all like it's like how it's 40 supply. This 1-2 supply unit could fend off 40 supply of medevacs, right? And because of he wasn't able to do that doom drop because like Terran versus Protoss was very tempo based at that time. He lost a lot of tempo. He lost like 1 minute because he couldn't do anything. He eventually, I would say, lost the game because of that. But I think if you break down like what the mothership core is, um, and I think most people like going back to it. I think most people take a look at the mothership core and they say hero unit bad. But I think we can also take a look at more in depth of like why the mothership core had issues. I think one of the main issues is that it was really very over centralizing and it was very lethal at the same time. So the fact that the mothership core was able to defend those 40 supply of units essentially, um, I think is a problem. In Stormgate, we don't want that. We want our heroes units to be very nuanced and more similar to like the power level of like a more powerful, I don't know, let's say a super ghost or like a slightly more powerful ghost, for instance, that maybe has additional power ups throughout the middle of the game, not tied to experience. Um, and we want it never to be super lethal, I think is a big part of it. The mothership core itself, even though the pylons were killing it, I think players associated the pylons with the mothership core. Um, in that the mothership core is overcharging the pylons and killing things. And I think it feels really bad for this 2 supply unit to be dealing all this damage in order to, and especially to kill units in particular. So we want to design our heroes with the idea in the mind that the heroes are not super lethal. We never want them to be like a superstar focus of the battle. And finally, I think the one thing about the mothership core is that it was introduced in a game where players were used to no heroes in the game and suddenly a hero is introduced. And this is an example of a type of asymmetry that I think feels a little off to me in that players have come to expect this is StarCraft 2 even, and you suddenly introduce this mechanic that is really foreign to a lot of players, and it kind of throws off like the mindsets of those players. So I think in a game mode where the heroes are more symmetric, and if in a game mode where everyone has a hero or this like kind of mothership core like unit, I think it'd be more palatable. So in a way, I would think of it maybe at the mothership core. It's like a mothership core, but maybe without like an overcharge ability.
So, what I'm kind of hearing, and all good things, the appropriate analysis of the Mothership Core, which every StarCraft 2 player has been around a while, has a strong opinion on. But Hero's more like kind of like a super sentry or something like that, that is able to provide support. In fact, I kind of consider the sentry almost a hero unit. A lot of players. The thing is, it's another example of asymmetry that is kind of not obvious to newer players. Like, a lot of players don't understand what Guardian Shield really does. Hallucination feels like it's kind of out of left field. It's this unit that has a lot of support. So, what I'm trying to say is something more along those lines is what you're targeting for any
Yeah,
sort of hero unit.
yeah, I would say like the ghost is probably not the best example because it is lethal. If I had to like pick, if I had to reframe it just off the top of my head, nothing that I prepared, something closer to like a super queen, for instance, where maybe you only have this one queen, and but this one queen has a lot of energy tension on it. Something that we talked about earlier. This one queen can like it can eject or it can transfuse or it can lay creep down, and these are all things that kind of help support your ally or help support your help support the player, but they're not things that are super lethal, right? They don't directly contribute to absolutely like murdering the enemy, right? So it's a supportive unit, and it's kind of what the mothership would be if it didn't have pylon overcharge or nexus overcharge.
So, we've talked a lot about different mechanics from StarCraft 2, WarCraft 3. One thing that I think is a core part of RTS, but isn't really one of the flashiest or most exciting, but a lot of players struggle with, is just growing your army infrastructure, specifically things like supply depots, overlords, etc. So, how will Stormgate handle that?
Yeah, so with regards to supply, what we're doing at Stormgate is we're trying to analyze the positives of supply or supply structures specifically, and the negatives of supply structures, and try to get the best out of the positives while minimizing the negatives. So if you think about like being supply blocked is a terrible feeling. Let's just get that like over with, right? You're supply blocked. You can't do anything for like X amount of time. It takes like 20 30 seconds to build that like supply structure, and the whole time you're like, oh, I really messed up, like this, I'm being very punished, and I hate myself right now. So that's one of the things we're trying to minimize. However, we actually experimented with getting rid of supply completely, and we feel like that also was not the right direction, because I think supply structures do two cool things. The first cool thing is that I feel like it's actually somewhat of an anti-snowball mechanic, right? Let's say we both we're playing like a PvP. We both have like 100 supply, and we both have 100 supply and pylons. And like you kill off half my army, I'm at 50 supply. You're still at 100 supply, right? In order for me to add 50 more supply back, I just have to build 50 supply of units. But for you, you have to build not only 50 supply and units, you have to add those pylons as well. So in that way, it's an extra cost to getting more ahead, right? And the second thing that I think supply structures do is that they're kind of a repeatable structure that you can build over the course of the game, and it creates a lot of interesting decision points as to where you place them. So over the course of the game, you place your first pylon, you place your second pylon, and you place your third pylon. In Stormgate, one of the things that we were going to try to do is to try to um, increase the importance of base building. So we want those moments to be very impactful. Um, and I think a game that does that well, I'm gonna go back to Warcraft 3, especially with the design of burrows and the idea of moonwells, right? These are two structures that cost some amount of money to build, and you're forced to build them because they're supply structures. Um, and you place them in interesting positions all the time. All your burrows, they have to be balanced between being able to defend your workers, but at the same time they're a harassment point. So you have to balance them being really far ahead versus behind in a more defensive position. And if you think about it, like you're forced to build these buildings, and maybe like let's say like a moonwell costs 100 gold. Maybe like the supply itself is actually maybe only worth 70 gold, right? And the 30 extra gold is budgeted towards the power of the moonwell, which is kind of like a shield battery. If you were if the Moonwell were just a farm, then you would just build these farms, and you wouldn't get this necessarily healing benefit. And if the Moonwell itself, or if like the shield battery aspect of it was a unit itself, you would just spam them because it costs 30 gold, right? Or like let's say 30 minnows. You would build like 50 billion shield batteries over like the map if you could spam them, right? But having it tied to a supply structure means that you encourage your players to build these at a staggered pace throughout the course of the game, at a predictable pace throughout the course of the game, without um, allowing players to really spam them because of cost restrictions.
So
Let's take it.
I
Okay,
just
go
want to
ahead.
jump in. So a little bit more like Overlords in StarCraft 2.
Exactly. So I was just going to get to that actually. If we go back to StarCraft 2 and we apply this idea to StarCraft 2, one thing that we notice is, the first few overlords, the first few supply depots, and the first few pylons are really interesting, right? And you wall off with the first few supply depots. You kind of spread your first like 8 or so overlords, and you place your first like 8 pylons really intelligently. But especially for overlords and supply depots, after the first 8, most players just kind of like spam them across the map, right? Or spam them in like at the back of their base, or they have this little corner of the map where they hide their overlords, right? So what we notice is like this decision making is really interesting for the first few moments of the game, or for the first like let's say 8 or so supply buildings, right? And I think Warcraft 3 hits like a really sweet spot there, where the game only forces you to build like on an average game there's like maybe 4 to like 8 at the maximum supply structures, and that creates 4 to 8 interesting decision moments, whereas in a game of StarCraft you have like these like 20 you build these like 20 overlords or 20 supply depots, and you really don't care about like where you place them over the map. So um, that's one lesson that we learned in order to make it so that every supply structure really matters. We want every supply structure to provide some amount of supply that makes it impactful for you to build, so that you never spam them and you never build them without decision making in mind. In addition, we want to minimize the negative feelings of supply structures. So we never really want supply to be like a really big factor in terms of you're blocked from doing anything. And we have some ideas that we're still trying out. For example, if you're supply blocked, you don't necessarily lose the ability to build units. You maybe like you're building units at a slower rate, right? Or another idea is maybe the supply structures build really quickly. So you're more limited by the cost. You still get the benefits of the first benefit I described, in which you stagger the growth of a winning player, but you don't get the negative feelings of like, I can't do anything for 20 seconds, and this is really frustrating. So imagine if like everything was like a call down drop, right? Call down supply drop, for
M-
instance.
Maybe something like an upkeep system where things are more costly if you don't have it, stuff like that. Opportunity cost. Oh, that's a lot more detail on supply depots than I ever thought about. I guess supply depots end up being kind of your wall off structure, but it doesn't feel like they're the best at that role, but they're the best you're going to get as a Terran player. Protoss have the kind of odd part of not being able to move their structures at all, so they have to leave gaps in them. And then, of course, Zerg has the complicated process of how they wall off. So in StarCraft 2, yeah, it doesn't really feel like there is much of a focus past those first 7 or 8 does sound about right on the supply structure. So, yeah, definitely. That's something even I, who rants about RTS all day, hasn't really thought about in depth of besides telling new players they need to know where they put their first few pylons. Thank you, K-Dong, for speaking with us at such length today. I think I heard, and I think a lot of people heard, a lot of positive things about the design and direction of Stormgate going forward. And I look forward to personally hearing more and more announcements from Frost Giant. One more time, what are you looking forward to the most, and where can people find Stormgate?
One more time. All right. I'm so glad you asked, because you can find Stormgate at playstormgate.com, where you can sign up for our beta, and B, you can check out our newsletter where you'll receive constant developmental updates. In addition to that, you can help us a lot out by wishlisting us on Steam. Wishlisting us so early on in development really helps with with the Steam algorithm. It'll really allow players to really see Stormgate, Steam users to see Stormgate, and really rises to the top of the charts when we officially release. And finally, you know what you can do? You can tell all your friends, all your cool friends who would just love to play Stormgate, especially with how social our game is going to be. So thank you, Winter. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to kind of shout out Stormgate and everywhere you can help us out at.
Thank you, Kevin. Have a great day. All right. So, we did it.
Yay.